Hey everyone, just wanted to start the video by thanking our sponsor for Romancing Saga Reuniverse. It's a free-to-play mobile game based on the long-running RPG franchise Romancing Saga. It is a constantly evolving story, tons of characters to collect, and classic turn-based combat inspired by the games. It's also celebrating its half anniversary with massive bonuses, over 20,000 jewels just for logging in over the month of December. If you're interested, click the link in the description of the video, and thanks again to Square Enix and Romancing Saga Reuniverse for sponsoring this video. Now, on to the video itself. Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on the latest Final Fantasy XIV raid tier, Eden's Promise Savage. Now, I tend to do these videos after clearing each and every raid tier when it comes out, and sometimes even on the ultimate encounters. But this one's going to have a little bit of extra weight on it, as it is the final raid tier of Shadowbringers. There is, of course, going to be Delibram Reginae, which is a 48-man Savage, though we don't expect that to actually be close to the 8-man Savage difficulties, and we are expecting another ultimate in 5.51. We don't know what it is yet, but they said they were working on it much earlier than we anticipated, and that was so they could put the resources towards other things after they were done with it. So there's a good chance that they're getting fairly close to the end of the development for that ultimate and doing some fine-tuning checks, even though it's still pretty early before 5.5. We just had 5.4 a week ago as of my recording of this. So I'm going to be focusing on how this raid tier compares to the previous two. Lessons I feel like they learned, and lessons they maybe could still learn going into the next Savage raid tier in 6.x. So with that, let's get started with the first encounter, E9 Savage. Now this has been displayed publicly, so I can take this opportunity to say that while E9 and E10 have been shown in the trailers, they've talked about them in the live letters, at least to a little degree, that E11 and 12 are going to be major spoilers, so I figure I might as well take care of that now. I will put timestamps in the description as well, so if you just want to watch certain parts of the raid tier compared to other parts or an overall thoughts, I'll make sure to put a timestamp for that, so you can skip right to that individual encounter. So anyway, like I was saying, E9 Savage, Cloud of Darkness, our first encounter for Eden's Promise Savage. This was a really strong fight to come out of the gate with. I have very few complaints, if any at all, about the way this fight is designed and the way that it flows. It's fairly fast-paced, the damage is high and satisfying, maybe a little bit uninteresting of a tank buster with that of Devouring Dark, but there's so many other tank mechanics, boss movements, placements for mechanics that are really, really precise that I was kind of surprised that they opened the raid tier with this. Now, the movements, while there are quite a few of them, they might be plentiful, but they're not particularly difficult. So it strikes that really interesting balance of having mechanics that you know could have been way worse, but are definitely tuned to that of a first encounter. And I feel like they really got that right here. That was a balance that was sort of there with E5 Savage against Ramu. It was almost there, but the movements were, I don't know, I guess a little more, I don't even want to say problematic in that encounter, but it seemed that people had a harder time grasping where they needed to be, where they needed to go, and when they needed to move. Whereas this encounter almost spells it out for you, you know, what needs to be done in what order and how those movements should, odds are, be done. There is definitely some room for player interpretation, especially during the Obscure Woods mechanic, and I think that that's okay because it, for the most part, only means that players will get better at those parts or players will figure out better ways to do those parts. But it also meant that early on, a lot of different strategies were adoptable and were flexible, and a lot of people had very varying experiences with generally the same success. And I think that as long as you can strike that balance where the difference in strategy doesn't necessarily make for a difference in success, I think is a really good way of having a mechanic for a first raid boss. And the Obscure Woods mechanic is definitely the most important one to talk about. The fight actually starts off even in a strong manner, displaying some of the boss's basic attacks so you can get some names down, and establishing the way that the boss is actually going to be functioning for all the attacks that aren't, I guess, phase specific. So when you actually see them later in the fight, you can easily pick apart how those mechanics are going to work, and any knowledge you took over from normal mode is likely going to be helping you with this as well. Now, one of my biggest takeaways from this very first boss, and something that actually persists across the rest of the raid tier, is a lesson that they've definitely learned over the course of Shadowbringers, because the boss's hitbox is huge. And this is actually the case for pretty much every boss that is in this entire raid tier. They're not always ginormous, but They essentially make it so that melees can more comfortably do mechanics without getting as far away from the boss. And I remember just everyone being surprised at the size of the hitboxes and the melees generally being happy with it, because the Shadowbringers raid tiers they've been kind of a toss-up with how melees can actually do mechanics or losing GCDs, and it's led to a lot more fighting amongst players about uptime strats versus safe strats here. And I feel like they kind of, again, this fight just displays so much balance. I hate using the word over and over again, but in role responsibility and in role performance, because a really good melee can make use of this super large hitbox and actually be able to make great uptime for this encounter, and it allows uptime strategies to really shine as well, while also being equally as safe. So a safe strat and an uptime strat don't need to be different things in this, and quite frankly in the rest of the encounters as well. And that's something that's good from a design standpoint, because it just means that it's easier for players to adapt to the various strategies without having to give up the performance of their job at the same time. Now this boss also sets a precedent from Stormblood that they revisit kind of in a Shadowbringers-esque manner. So Stormblood is very well known for first half of the fight is, everything's new, everything goes through, and the second half of the fight is just repeat the first half of the fight, but maybe faster or maybe more damage or something like that. This kind of does that, but it also takes the Shadowbringers method of developing fights, of evolving those mechanics as they appear again. A big example is there's Obscure Woods 1 and Obscure Woods 2. Now, everything you learn from Obscure Woods 1 works, and then when you get to Obscure Woods 2, you'll see a lot of the same mechanics, but the responsibilities that they're mixed in with will be changed slightly. So you'll have to do different movements, you'll have to think about the space that you have available a little bit differently, but you'll still be completely familiar with the phase overall. So it's a nice, I'm not going to say it. It's the middle road of the two. There we go. That's a better way of putting it. And I'm just really impressed with the overall fight design here. The empty plane part of the fight, preventing you from jumping while you have to go through those platform swaps. Again, deceptively easy movement that is, when the failure is tracked, it tracks hard because people just drop down. It's something that there's again, very finite ways you can do the movement for that phase. So there's really only a couple of options that you have, and again, that just makes it so that while it may seem like, there's no way people could pug this, or it's going to be way too hard, once you realize it's just one of two movements for that entire phase, everything just kind of clicks. And I'm glad to see that they've really nailed this part down I really can't applaud this first encounter enough. It's definitely my favorite encounter for first encounters of this expansion. And even though it doesn't quite compare in the same ways, for me, it's comparable to Chaos from back in Stormblood, who I think is definitely one of the best first bosses we've had since the creator era of Savage tiers in particular. If I had to put Midas in there, then Midas would probably still be my favorite for a first boss encounter. But with that going into the various phases, the damage being very high, it tests all the things that a Savage Raider should really be able to do. All the very basics of spatial awareness, of understanding oncoming damage, using mitigation, properly using tank busters, positioning, all those things are very well tested here. If this was somebody's first Savage Raid tier, they would cut no breaks, but they also would be able to properly learn kind of what's expected of you throughout the rest of the encounter. So this definitely holds for me as the best first encounter across the Savage Raid tiers for Shadowbringers. Moving on to the second encounter, I'm still kind of twiddling my thumbs and racking my brain at how I really, really feel about this encounter. So the second encounter is against the Shadowkeeper, and that is, the name basically tells you how the majority of the mechanics are going to work. There's going to be all sorts of shadows that will either copy mechanics or tell you where mechanics are going to go, or copy AoEs from the boss, and it's very gimmicky. It's probably the most gimmicky encounter of the entire raid tier, and I say that knowing full well that I have to talk about E11 Savage after this, but it works. I think it really does work, because again, it's only testing the most basic understanding of the ways that the AoEs work, watching animations in order to understand which attacks are coming out, and again, understanding the space around you. Any player re-clearing this should feel really good about the knowledge they picked up from the last time they did it, and be able to apply it in better and better ways in order to maximize efficiency. We're already seeing some of the strategies for the later portions of this encounter be reworked to be a little bit easier on the various roles and just easier to execute overall. And this continues the trend of making better uptime, making better strategies is actually along the same lines is actually making the mechanics safer to do. It's why I really hope this raid tier people are willing to learn new strategies. There is such a thing as having way too many strategies to learn. I've seen that a lot with E9 Savage. Apparently, one of the strategies I used to clear has become popular, even though I hadn't even made a guide on it. But people liked it, and I'm glad it's working, but I hope people understand that what they see week one might work and might seem really simple to understand basic, but it's all very improvable in very clear ways as well. So again, the fight design here, it's great. I just don't know how I'm going to feel about the gimmick of the shadows as weeks go on and on and on, especially as we get more and more gear and we actually skip some of the more fun mechanics later in the encounter. That's kind of a thing I am a little concerned about with some of these encounters, is skipping some of the, I guess, better design mechanics later on. And I guess at that point, you've been clearing it so many times. Are you really concerned about not seeing something you've done, 4, 5, 6 plus times? But I always am worried that people are just going to get used to that idea. It's a fear across all content, but when it happens in the current Savage tier, people end up, how do I say this? They develop an expectation that a mechanic will be skipped, and people get a little complacent about performing it on a week-to-week basis if they actually see it. We saw that a lot with Führer, the fight that I'm going to directly compare this to, where the final 3 mechanics of the encounter, if a party finder doesn't defeat it by around the time Conflag Strike went off, that's when it usually all fell apart, if it hadn't already fallen apart before that. So that I'm very much concerned about happening across the various skill levels that are in the Party Finder. But it shouldn't be as big a deal here, because the lesson you learn at the start of the encounter carries through all the way to the end. And outside of a mechanic or two that I think people might struggle with, I think that will be enough to get most people through it on a week-to-week basis. Now, like I said, I need to compare this to the other encounters from the previous raid tiers and Shadowbringers. And you know what? This is actually kind of a tough one, because I'd say that E2 Savage against Voidwalker was a very well put together second encounter, and we're going to have to revisit a little bit later because some very Voidwalker-esque mechanics do appear in the third and fourth encounter here. But it was very well constructed. It was a fight that people could definitely tell would be harder if it was like a final tier fight. But it also was a very good attention check, a very good dodge check, punishing with things like damage down, punishing with just a ton of damage on the individual player. Pretty good outgoing damage, a lot of exact positioning, the ability to fall off. And all of those things created an encounter that I'd say is still memorable to this day, and a big reason why I'm going to applaud the next 2 encounters as well. So Voidwalker stands strong, and I think this is kind of tied for it, but I really don't know how I'm going to feel about the Shadow gimmick after a few weeks, if it'll just be kind of boring because it's so simple to understand once you've seen it a couple of times, or if I'll feel good about getting that right, week after week after week, or if I'll just be like, ugh, this, all right, go left again, whatever it is it may be. So that one I'm gonna leave open for debate. Führer is kind of a tough one. I actually kind of like Führer. I know a lot of tanks in particular because of the Conflag Strike later, and I know some melees who aren't a big fan of it. But that fight flows so quickly that 8-9 minutes go by in that fight in a flash. And for me, that's kind of a good thing. So for me, all of the second encounters have a stronger showing than I feel gets talked about. And I think that's kind of a divisive opinion when it comes to the various raid tiers we've had this expansion. I just say that they're all kind of on par with each other. They're all different enough in their own ways. They all have their own vibe. They're harder to compare to one another to me. And for that reason, I can't really knock E10 Savage for anything in particular. Having a gut feeling about how I'll feel about something in a few weeks is not a fact. And considering I liked it during Prague, I had a lot of fun with it during Prague, I'm not going to let that fear make me rule this lower, or, ignoring the fear make me rank it higher than I otherwise would. It's solid all the way through. It's got incredibly deadly tank busters, a more animation watching, and honestly some really great visuals. I will say E10 Savage, one thing that gives it a lot of points for me is the shadow mechanic, the one where players get shadows and they have to aim the AoEs. When you do that successfully, that is one of the cleanest, neat-looking mechanics that people are going to feel good getting right. And it's rare that we talk about how good it feels to do a mechanic right. We often will only talk about how bad it feels to do certain mechanics wrong, aka light rampant. But this feels amazing to do it correctly. And that's something that's really good for encouraging players and them feeling up to it week after week after week. So, you know what? Yeah, I'm pretty confident they'll all be about even for me personally in terms of clearing them week to week. And I'm looking forward to seeing if that holds up because it was a solid fight and I hope other people enjoy it too. Now, the third encounter, I'll tell you what, this is definitely the best of the third encounters that we've had because Shadowbringers has not had good third encounter design in Savage for one reason or another. Some of it might be that E3 Savage and E7 Savage both were, standing bosses. They both basically just floated along the northern edge. They had no positionals, and you had the whole arena behind you, and just... I'm never a super big fan of bosses that stay still in one place. Sometimes it's okay for a specific phase, such as back in E9 Savage during the empty plane mechanic. Cloud of Darkness will root herself in the middle. But because of the clouds coming in from the outside and the space under you, it's hardly something you even think about. Your brain doesn't really have time to process that the boss is staying in one place because you're too busy making sure you don't fall off or drop down to your death from standing on a platform with two people or for too long. So this already gets points for that because this boss is one that is very mobile. It is one that requires a lot of attention. He's going to constantly be turning, which is a hindrance for melees, but you do it enough times and you'll get used to the timings for things like True North, Riddle of Earth, whatever your positionals that you may need and when they'll be. And that'll probably come with time. It also aims at players, so I assume that after weeks, almost all the attacks in E11 Savage are actually baited to a random player. So if players are just not spread out, you start to be able to predict where the boss will face for certain mechanics a lot more easily. And that's also going to reduce the amount of frustration that can go to melees when the boss is turning this way to do a mechanic, turning that way to do a mechanic. Because that is probably one of the weakest parts of the early prog for this was the constant turning and turning and turning. The disorientation that comes with it, even just for getting to the proper position, is also just a little bit of a nightmare, in my opinion. As for everything else, the visuals for the encounter, the music, the actual boss mechanics, they all worked really well. And I mentioned that for the third and fourth encounter that I'd probably have to refer back to Voidwalker a bit more. And that's because this is basically what if Voidwalker was the third encounter in a fight. A lot of it is the boss will use an attack, it'll have an element tied to it, something visual, and you'll have to use the visuals in order to determine how to actually handle said attack. And there was 2 or 3 different patterns, depending on the phase of the encounter, that were actually possible that you'd have to deal with at any given time. It all comes together towards the very end, where the boss will spam all 3 mechanics of the same element, and you'll have to do them in very, very quick conjunction, or risk just dying. I have to praise it for the same reasons I kind of praise Voidwalker, even if it's just a little samey, a little too samey to that. It definitely stands on its own legs in some way. Very interesting dual tank buster that comes out of one of those elemental mechanics, one that isn't really anything like what we had in Voidwalker. I'm specifically referring to the lightning bound by faith. I actually am a big fan of that very, very basic movement and mechanic that is. There's also some things that are very much not relatable to Voidwalker. A lot of stuff where he's enhancing elements of different AoEs around the room, transition periods that have, some kind of light communication between the parties, some light understanding of where people need to be. And the only thing I could really knock when it comes to that is that the transitions with all the downtime are just kind of annoying. It's always better for me to be asked to be hitting a boss while doing a mechanic. And I understand that the dev team, if they want to make a more intricate mechanic, they actually like removing the boss as a function, which is why for a lot of, mix-up combos like you see with E11 Savage, that you'll actually just see them remove the boss altogether, and then they'll just go nuts with like, oh, this attack there, that attack there, followed by this attack, this attack, this attack, because they just employ that kind of development thought behind it of making sure that if you remove the boss, you can do more difficult things because people aren't focused on outputting damage as much damage as they can. So I'm always a bigger fan of actually asking you to do both things. Ultimate Annihilation in the Ultimate Weapon Ultimate Encounter is the thing I'm a huge fan of, and I wish we had more stuff like that. But that doesn't actually take away. Solving these was a lot of fun. Doing them week to week is going to require people to be pretty exact. And I do think that that will be fun enough that this will continue to stand as the best third encounter across the entirety of Shadowbringers. In my opinion, the bar is just so low for that, though, that whether or not this continues to be a fun fight will be determined by how much people are okay with little things like melees needing to move out for the lightning burst strike or burnt strike. Whether or not, people are really annoyed by the downtime phases, or how easy it is to screw up certain mechanics or stand in the wrong place and die. I think it is a very exacting fight. I think it does require very quick reflexes and very quick understanding of what you're seeing in terms of the ability name versus what the visuals have. And it's a lot of skills that players should definitely have by this point, and it should make it actually a pretty easy re-clear on most weeks, as long as people don't forget strategies in between. It also means that there are not too many different ways to approach this. The only real things I imagine people will change with this encounter going into future weeks is really nailing down positioning, so it's easier to understand what the boss will be doing and where they'll be doing it. There are some light uptime strats that are possible in certain parts of the encounter, given that certain elements are selected at certain times and are not hindering them from actually getting in. But overall, solid encounter. I'm really hoping I still like this one a few weeks down the line, because I do not need a 0 for 3 on not liking re-clears of the third encounter on any given week. So off to a good start, but I'm going to keep my eye on this one, and I might have to do some updated thoughts on this third encounter. And then finally we come to the fourth encounter, and I'm also a bit divided on this one after having time to stop and understand it. Now, let me say that progging this was actually a ton of fun. There's a lot of rapid fire mechanics, tons of damage, and again, very clear visual help from the arena and from the boss themselves. Understanding what you did wrong and first interpretations of a mechanic, even if it can be done better, this is again a really high point. In fact, this is probably the second best visualization of mechanics since Cloud of Darkness, earlier in the very same raid tier. The arena is constantly giving you AoE indications when you otherwise wouldn't have them. It allows you to properly space out mechanics, helps you understand how mechanics actually work. And this is actually going to remain true for both the first and the second phase of this encounter. And I think that having those visual representations without outright showing you the AoE marker on the ground is a great way to get players to learn to pay attention to their surroundings more. Think about this for future raid tiers. Think about this for future bosses. And it's a skill that's largely lost. We used to identify so many mechanics based on little things on the arena back in the previous raid tiers, and I just don't see people do that as much anymore. I think this will reinstill that idea into a lot more people's thoughts when they are raiding. And at least I hope it'll do that, because that was one of the biggest positive takeaways that I had from this. It also has a good deal of randomness while still being scripted enough that you can, properly prepare for the whole encounter. The entire first, minute and a half of this fight is, other than the AoEs and the tank buster, pretty much completely random. Whether you'll be doing stack or spread markers, what types of AoEs you'll be dodging from the various casts that are coming out. All of that is randomized and makes every attempt, sometimes you go, oh, not this one at this time. And sometimes you go, yes, I really like this one. Everyone's probably going to have favorites and not favorites of the different combinations of casts that you can actually get. And I think that gives the fight a little bit of a personality, especially in the way that people interpret it as whether they get angry or whether they're happy with what actually happens on any given pull, especially as the melees, again, who are always looking to optimize that uptime. Now, that being said, the reason why I'm a bit torn about this one is because it brings back something I wasn't a super big fan of going back to Stormblood. In that, while I'm going to talk individually about the first phase and the second phase, it is a boss that you beat, you get a checkpoint, and for the rest of the instance, you're on the second boss in that instance. So you beat the first boss once that instance, and then you just got to beat the second boss before the timer kicks up. That, in theory, isn't too bad. When they first did it in Stormblood with Exdeath and Neo Exdeath, I thought it worked really well. Exdeath was a less than 5-minute fight, and Neo Exdeath was like a 12 to 12.5-minute fight. You got like an ultimate length encounter out of it by the end of the day, and that first encounter was so fast-paced and so stressful but fun to execute that I couldn't help but love it. But has every door boss after Exdeath has been a question mark for me. I am not a fan of Kefka and God Kefka, especially from just a door boss perspective. And I'm kind of the same with Omega MNF and Final Omega. It just didn't work because the door bosses ended up being full-length bosses at that point, 8 minutes-ish for both of the door bosses before you actually go on to the next encounter. Now, as a result, the second encounter is usually, like 10 and a half minutes, something like that. So they did shorten the second encounter, but man, when you're going through week after week, it just doesn't feel good to me to have those super long first bosses followed by a slightly shorter second boss. It's just a preference thing. I don't think it's necessarily anything wrong with it. It just doesn't feel as good to me. And that happens here, but this one's even weirder. This one's an 8-minute and 27-second first encounter, followed by an 8-minute and 57-second second encounter. So both encounters are almost the same length. And again, I don't dislike either of these fights, but they're just so short that I would just prefer a different split in terms of the time investment that goes into this. The door boss feels like just as much a part of the final boss as the final boss. And you know what? When you say it out loud, and it sounds like that's what they're probably going for, it works. It doesn't fall on its face and fall flat. It isn't for me. That much I'll say. I just don't enjoy that as much. Fortunately, this is the best door boss they've ever designed from a mechanics standpoint. You've already applauded some of its various aspects. Even just looking at how it's translated some things from normal mode into Savage, there's a really long sequence in normal mode that's entirely for story purposes, and it actually is mostly worked into the Savage encounter, but in a seamless manner. Some of the same ads show up, some of the same mechanics show up in certain ways, and it all just kind of works. And it takes you a second to realize you're even re-experiencing normal mode in a more savage, environment. But that works. That really, really works. And I like seeing that transition of stuff that we know from normal mode going into Savage. It always feels bad when you see something in normal, and you're like, oh, I can't wait to see that in Savage. And it's just kind of gone. But then when it comes to a long transition phase like normal mode, you're like, oh, thank God that's not there in Savage. I would hate that. But they didn't abandon the mechanics that came with it. And I think that goes to show a lot of attention to detail about what those different aspects of that normal mode encounter really should mean in the Savage context. It also has a bit of memory involved, having to remember, oh, the boss saved that and used it later. I'm not a huge fan of Guardian back in Stormblood, but that reminds me this reminds me of that. And when this is, I think, a better version of that executed. The problem with Guardian's I'll save this mechanic for later way of working was that it was always set to be basically one of two things depending on how the boss started the fight. Once people figured out there were only two possible patterns for the whole fight, that kind of ruined it, because then it was literally just, you didn't even have to remember to save mechanics for later. You just had to identify what pattern it was, and you knew the rest of the fight. There was no question marks about what you were going to be doing the rest of the encounter. For this, every single time the boss goes to cast a spell, including whether they're saving it for later or casting it immediately, you need to be paying attention. You need to be able to read the surroundings, or at least communicate with your team to make sure you're all on the same page. And I think that's better executed than that. This is how I would have liked to have seen the Guardian encounter actually go. And I'm glad they gave it a try again, and in my opinion, did it correct. The normal mode, on the other hand, works a little bit more like Guardian, although I think it's even less random than that, because I know the entire first phase is pretty much set in stone in normal mode. I think in Savage it's I think in the second half of normal mode it opens up a little bit, but the Savage encounter gets it. They definitely get it. The only part of the first encounter that people are definitely going to be talking about for weeks and weeks to come, although it already seems like a great uptime strategy was found for it, one that's again way safer than it would otherwise appear, is what's been deemed Lions Rampant, playing on Lights Rampant from E8. And it's basically a bunch of lions, 4 lions tethered to either the tanks and healers or the DPS. There's 2 other lions that need to be baited by the nearest player, and then the boss has a few mechanics in between each of the AoEs that goes out. It's the one part of the first fight where if people are going to fall apart, it's going to be here, even if they get everything flawlessly correct. Because even just the slightest angle being off will put a fire breath through another teammate, and then it's just a domino effect from there, unless it happens at the very, very end of the mechanic. There's, again, a lot of ways to do this, but I've already seen people finding ways where melee DPS can basically get full uptime, tanks can get full uptime if they actually have the tethers. And in my opinion, it looks to be even safer than doing it where, you run to the edge and try to aim the AoEs outward and stuff like that, because there's so much less movement, there's so much less room for error. So I'm glad to see people have already been working on improving what will likely be the most annoying strategy to do on a week-to-week basis. but it's at least easy enough to understand. When I saw Light Rampant for the first time, I had no idea how to dissect that. I really had to slow my brain down and be like, okay, so we need this and this to happen, and these people need to be the ones in at the end. And, once you broke it down enough, it didn't seem so bad. But at first, it was just a mishmash of colors and noises and disasters. Lions Rampant, you literally see, if you have all 8 people alive, you literally see those 4 tethers go on to people. You see the 2 other big lions, and you see the mechanic coming out of the boss, and it's almost immediately recognizable what needs to happen in that phase. There's almost no question within seconds of seeing it what needs to happen, even if you don't know exactly how you're going to go about doing it. And again, that clarity, that design, that is why this is my favorite raid tier for this expansion. It's just so much better designed than the other ones in terms of accessibility, both in terms of visuals and in terms of role. And just, it's more fun. And the music's also great, even though we did definitely have some slappers, more original sounding slappers across the rest of the raid tiers, and I'll always be missing E4 and E8 Savage tracks. Now, ironically enough, I'm seeing so many praises for the first phase. The mechanics are tight, the visuals are great. I also like the boss audio that comes out of this one. I'm a huge fan of when they add voices to bosses, especially in Savage encounters, because I use it as an extra audio click to tell what mechanic is currently happening. But then we actually go into the fact that this is, again, a checkpoint boss. Cutscene in the middle. I'm not going to talk about, how cool the cutscene is, how cool the music in the second phase is, even though it definitely is. But the second encounter, I think, is easier than the first, even though it's a little bit longer, and I think the pressure of beating it is going to make you screw up a little bit more. I think that the final boss in Savage is actually easier. I didn't feel that way at first, but by the time we had beaten it, we'd realized that you could really break down all of the major mechanics into really simple instructions. And all everyone had to do is know where they belonged based on what their debuffs were or what ability was going out at the time. I think this will be a really good Party Finder final encounter. I think it'll go way better than Shiva on average, especially because it has a checkpoint, and definitely way better than Titan, which often failed in the first 30% in the Party Finder over and over again. And I think that even though it's easier, it's so satisfying to do correctly, more satisfying than the first phase. And it's still relatively exacting on the players, and that is an unintentional pun. I just like to use the word relative a lot, as I'm sure you've noticed. And I don't know, it's hard for me to really think of much to say. The mechanics are very much, the entire thing is super Final Fantasy VIII themed, whether it be the music, the voice lines, the attacks that are actually being used, Shockwave, Pulsar, the words going into the relativity mechanics. And it's just so satisfying. Again, it's like E10. It's so satisfying to do correctly that I just love watching it happen, where there's these little moments where you're just rewinding through time in order to place AoEs that you had to think of placing well in advance. But it's also not difficult to execute on. So you get this great satisfaction of seeing everything happen and occur properly, followed by something that shouldn't be too difficult to replicate once you've done it a couple of times. There's also already been improvements to advanced relativity, the final mechanic, that make it, in my opinion, even easier. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that we've kind of already gone through so much of the strategy adjustment to this so early that it should mean really good pug groups for this, really good party finders. And it's rare that I say that about a raid tier. Almost everyone sees a new raid tier, watching people progress at week 1. They go, man, I don't know how the party finder is going to do that. I don't know how a black mage could possibly do that. It happens every time. But this one, I've never felt that way. I looked at them all as puzzles that could be solved and then could be solved slightly better. And the answers almost were obvious about how they could be improved. And thus the improvements were made so quick that any improvement that's made after this is just ultra optimized. And while maybe a little unnecessary, in all honesty, it's almost probably going to be even safer or even more efficient without losing any safety. And it's crazy to me that after all of this expansion of fighting over this way of doing it versus that way of doing it, that they found a way of making a fight that feels dynamic. It feels interpretable in so many different ways, but is so clearly improvable that I don't think anyone's going to fight over what the right way to do it is. Yeah, I know there's 5 different strategies for how to do brambles in the first fight, and that'll probably be the most discussed one across all the tiers, along with Lions Rampant. But this final encounter just embodies kind of everything that I've grown to like about this tier. It's a little too on the Stormblood design for me, especially with the final Enrage being AoE, 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 big AoE, 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 big AoE, 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 big AoE, beat it before the Enrage cast. It's way too Stormbloody for me, and while, you know, we don't have it all the time, we haven't had it all throughout. At least they didn't do the whole first half, second half, you know, being the same kind of thing. It definitely evolves all the way through and invokes enough positive emotion after doing it that I do look forward to doing this again. I'm not really dreading it. I just hope that my opinion and my feelings about this keep up week after week after week, because I'm going to be doing this a lot for the next several months. So I better like it as far as I'm concerned. As for comparing it to the previous final bosses, again, because it's a door boss and not just one full encounter, it's actually tough. Titan had the issue of being front-loaded with difficulty and being really easy on the back end. Shiva had the issue of people just not being able to do light rampant, but then underestimating later mechanics. But also with the super long cutscene where you're not controllable in the middle of the fight, it definitely knocked the points out of this. This has a super uncontrollable cutscene, but it also, you know, it's a checkpoint, so you don't have to see it more than once per instance if you're wiping over and over again. And having the checkpoint means if you wipe going into phase 2, you don't have to do an entire 14-minute encounter again. You just have to do the second 9-minute encounter again. So there's pros and cons to all of that. As for how I feel, I think because the door boss is so good, and even though the second boss I think is easier than the door boss, I do think it's very, very crisply designed. I think it takes the cake as my favorite final encounter for this expansion as well. It's close because Titan's there. He's really close because of how strong the early parts of his fight are, but I think I got to give it to this. It's close, but it's no cigar as far as I'm concerned. Overall, I hope they take the lessons about interpretation of mechanics as well as accessibility to the boss being a big thing going into 6.0. The fact that all the boss hitboxes were so big and that all the mechanics were easily distinguishable amongst a mess of effects on the screen is probably the biggest takeaway from this raid tier. It's a whole expansion's worth of lessons learned, and I hope that whoever was responsible for developing these passes those lessons along to anyone who's going to come after or anyone who's going to be working alongside them as they develop future raid tiers, even other content like Delubrum Regine or the next Ultimate. I just hope that these lessons are learned in such a way that, you know, we just have better designed encounters going forward, because they nailed it at this. Things they still need to learn, they need to find a better way of handling final bosses. It doesn't always need to be a door boss or some sort of long cinematic cutscene. There is room to just do a final boss again. I mean, if you look back to Coil and Alexander, I mean, they have huge cinematic super attacks, but you don't have to, you know, try to be this over ambitious story. It's one of those things that's cool only once. I know some people are thinking maybe they can make you skip it or let you skip it after the first time, or if everyone's already beaten the encounter before or something like that. But I think they just need to stop looking at doing things or like they have to do things one of those two ways, because in the last two expansions they've kind of narrowed themselves into that corner. And I just don't know if they can get back up out of it, because there's got to be a different way to do it as far as I'm concerned. And I'll just have to cut myself off there and wrap up the video, because as I'm sure you heard in the last half a second, I started to turn into a robot again, a problem I've had with random points in videos in recent weeks. So I'll take that as an opportunity to re-record this ending and just say that I hope that they just remember some of these lessons that we've talked about today going into the next raid tier in 6.x. But anyway, thank you for taking your time to watch this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And I will see you all in the next several. We're going to be doing all the Savage guides. We're going to be doing some more discussions on the individual encounters. We're going to be doing our normal guides, dungeons, melee, versus, monk thoughts, spoiler cast, Air Zivia, all that stuff in the coming weeks. It's going to be pretty busy on the YouTube channel for once in the last couple of months. But anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. And until then, take care.